Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Wolfram Institute live stream. Today we have Luke Weinbach. He's a student at Yale University studying computer science, linguistics, sociology, and politics. He's interested in how machines can wield the power of language and what that means, what the implications are for society, technology, and social issues. Today, Luke will be presenting the project he did at the Wolfram Summer School this past summer, and we'll be talking about assessing LLM psychology with personality vectors. Luke, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Dugan, and thank you everybody else involved with having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and kind of share my experience with this project and kind of what I think the long-term vision is, and first and foremost, why you should care. Because I was mentioning this briefly earlier, I think it's an interesting project just on pure academic merits that you can even, begin to measure what the psychology of a large language model would look like. But the reason I started this project in the first place is because I think there is a long-term vision, for strategic product implementation that I think is could be very interesting and very, profitable, lucrative, helpful to a bunch of people if you could make something like this work on a large scale. So I guess so you're not just staring at the live stream. I'll put up this little um, this little image for you to look at and ponder over as I explain this first part for a couple of minutes, which is basically the part on why should you even care about the psychology of your LLM and why did I start this project in the first place. So the idea came to me because of the rather obvious to people who work with LLMs every day realization that agents are taking over the world very, very fast. And eventually, and by eventually, potentially sooner than any of us really expect, we will be living in a world where agents make a lot of daily business, daily personal, daily political even decisions um, on our behalf. Whether or not that is supervised by humans remains to be seen. But the point is, there's a lot of time and money and just general human effort investment going into the development of AI that make decisions. And that poses a pretty big risk to anyone who knows a lot about LLMs or AI. And the risk there is obviously that LLMs are prone to make wild, errant decisions just like any other human is. So that poses an issue. And the issue, of course, is that LLMs are notoriously black boxes. It's very difficult to know what the internal workings of an LLM are doing, and thus it's very difficult to take any sort of real knowledge about LLMs and use it as a mechanism for behavioral prediction. Um, so, what drew me to this project specifically is that the only basis we could ever have for using any sort of observational science to predict behavior of a complex system would be found in neuroscience and psychology. It's the only field that has ever been successful in making such a prediction. And of course, the complex system is the human brain, which I would argue is more complicated than any LLM uh, we have ever devised. And psychology is very imperfect science, but we have developed methods in psychological research for evaluating people's behavior, people's personality, and using that to some extent, at least beyond random chance, predict behavior, predict affinity for certain things. And so this project stems from the idea that we might be able to use elements, nuggets of truth from human psychology, apply them to LLMs, which are, of course, based on human language. I, as someone who studies linguistics, knows better than anyone that so much of the human experience and our thought process can be encapsulated in language. So if you have this system built on, you know, billions, trillions of data points of human language, then it might start to develop personalities that exhibit themselves in ways that human personalities do. So that's where the background of this project comes from. If I find you can use psychological testing to effectively, at least above some, level of chance, predict behavior, decision-making behavior, or even affinity for certain tasks for certain LLMs with engineered prompt personalities and things like that. Well, all of a sudden, that's pretty big and interesting because you develop a way of more reliably producing agents that do certain things really, really well. And then you can identify agents in your development phase that are not performing very well and making decisions you don't want them to be making. So I think that this framework, this model of thinking about LLMs as people with brains that have personalities and psychologies, can be quite interesting if it pans out and it turns out that, they are exhibiting these traits. So what you're looking at on the screen right now is the sort of top-down hero image used on my Wolfram Summer School community post. And everything I'm sharing today on a notebook is available for you to look at and play with on my community posts, which I'm sure you'll be able to find a link to that somewhere on whatever platform you are watching this from. Um, so I think I'll start by explaining the notebook from the perspective of these two images, which we will kind of get to at the very end of the notebook explanation. And just so you can kind of have like this little, I'm going to dangle the carrot in front of your face, so to speak, so you can kind of see what the long-term vision is and where I've gotten to up to this point. So this is the culmination of what I did at the Wolfram Summer School, these two kind of plots. On the right, I'll start with you have a stacked bar graph, which is labeled Summary of Big Five Test Results. Now, what does that mean? Well, the psychological framework that I use to study LLM psychology is the one that has been most successful in describing human psychology, which is the Big Five test, or it's also called the Ocean test, based on the initials of the five major categories there on the x-axis: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, or the five-factor model, or a couple of other different names. But this is the most kind of academically well-reputable source for studying human psychology. And I'll add this little note in there. My intuition is that if this works as a model for studying and predicting LLM behavior, that because LLMs and humans are slightly different, again, my intuition is that there might be a better test out there that we could devise kind of specifically tailored to be fed to LLMs. But of course, within the time constraints, I wanted to go with something that didn't require any sort of really heavy research and had already been kind of academically well-founded before I started trying to apply it. So that's what you see on the right. It's this stacked bar chart measuring the results of feeding the Big Five test questionnaire, which I'll get to later in the notebook, to ChatGPT's base model, um, without any sort of engineering personalities via prompt. Um, and then the graph you see is a measurement, obviously broken down by those five major traits. And each of those major traits has six subtraits. So you can see that breakdown kind of there. And of course, I'll get to more once I get into the notebook. On the left, you see a community clustering chart where each of the arrows, where each point has three arrows extending out from it that indicate its three closest neighbors within this cluster graph. This is scaled down from 300 dimensions, a 300-dimensional vector that I will get to later, which basically shows a clustering of certain personalities um, that we see after we run this test through the whole pipeline. So that's kind of what I'm building towards, and I want to now move over to this notebook where I'm going to kind of walk you through kind of step by step what I did to get up to this point. And then at the end, I'll kind of give a where do we go from here kind of spiel about um, where I'm at right now and how that affects kind of the vision for the future and the direction. So I'm going to pivot over to this notebook. Can you all see the notebook?
Yes. as you can
Perfect.
see.
Okay. So my project, at least the extent to the work, the extent of the work I did at the summer school, it's kind of broken down into four steps. The goal here was obviously to test whether or not you can imbue an LLM with certain aspects and personality traits. Because in order to find out if you can use personality engineering as sort of a metric for predicting behavior and things like that, well, you kind of first have to figure out if you can even give them personality traits at all. So that was kind of the goal of the summer school project. And so I did that starting with this kind of four-step process. So the first thing I did was I was generating personas. Um, what I have here is a data set of personality prompt components relating archetypal high or low scoring personality facets tracked by the Big Five test. Now, what that means is for each of the 30 traits measured by the Big Five test, I have both a positive and a negative prompt. So you can see here for this imagination, which is just the first one in the openness category, um, you have a prompt here. This top one would be kind of a stereotypical low scoring prompt for imagination. And then the bottom one is, or excuse me, high scoring prompt for imagination. And the bottom one is the low scoring prompt for imagination. I did not just invent these. Let me move over to this document. That's not quite, screen sharing paused. Mm, maybe this one's not working. Okay, that's fine. You can find a link to this in the community post. Um, it's referenced in the sources. It is an online version of this test, which at the end, once you take it, sort of gives a description of what each of the 30 personality facets are describing. And all I've done with these prompts is I've taken these descriptions and I've kind of engineered them from descriptive sort of analyses of the trait into a prescriptive, second person statement. Like, for example, you believe that the world or the real world is often too plain and ordinary. And I've done that systematically for all 30 traits. And I've engineered one to be positive and one to be basically the opposite of that, which would be the negative one. So we have this big data set here of all these personality traits, which each have associated with them two prompts. I have this example here, which I can run to give you a quick, oops, that's through an error, but it's because not much of this is not initialized. I recommend downloading, if you want to try this for yourself, I recommend downloading the community post notebook from Wolfram Community. But what this is supposed to do is define this data set of LM personalities. We use entity value here just to create little names, which are supposed to be quick keys for identifying each of the personality traits. And the format you can at least see is this, where the entity value would be the key, and then you have a table which takes a sample of personality traits from this giant list up top, which has since vanished. Um, and I knew this might happen, so I pasted the sample which I've used in my actual research, and we won't run into a bunch of the errors later because all of the other functions will use this data set, which is the one from the community post. So this is what it actually looks like, kind of on the back end, which you see. So you can see we have all of our keys generated, and then we take a sample of 5 prompts. 5 is just kind of it was a nice number that made the computation not too intense. As it is, I generated a sample of 30 personalities, I believe, and even then it took hours to run this through the LLM pipeline to get systematic answers for each one and then to plot them. So the community post, if you view it, is based off of a sample of 30. Of course, you can download it and run it for yourself with your own API keys. Um, I used GPT-4 because my OpenAI API key was the one that I had readily available. It would be really interesting. In fact, if you do this, please reach out to me at some point. Try it with other models. You can see what the results are, and I would love to kind of work on that with you. Um,
So
so
how
we
did you
have
decide like on the 30? So yeah, there were six subcategories in the big five attributes, right?
right.
So
There
is
are
that
six subcategories, 30 traits in total because each of this,
okay?
sorry, each there are five categories. Like it's the big five, so it's five categories, and then each one has six of the subcategories. So total of 30. It felt like a nice number. So if you have I think that is really coincidence that it turned out to be the same as the number of traits. But I think the reason I set it on 30 is because at first I tried 100 and the runtime was not very good. So I thought 30 was kind of a nice downgrade from that, but still enough to get a couple useful nuggets, especially the 30 was able to randomly generate a minimal pair, which is to say two personalities that only separate themselves by one trait, which I'll get to in the result plots, which turned out to be very, very interesting. Um, so 30 was just purely time and resource constraints. Um, Obviously, doing this on a systematic level would require probably more than 30, but I also wanted to keep it consistent for the sake of presenting this as a complement to the summer school project, which the paper written on that is based on this 30 length data set. It's the same data set which is pasted here with all of these names, which we will get into later. So this is this is the easiest step. All I did was kind of engineer these personalities, put them into a giant data set, and we have a random sample of 30 of them. So the next thing, well, we have our personalities, but we actually want to give them this test. Um, so let's look at that. The test is a 300 question questionnaire. It's hidden in one of these drop down boxes, which if I expanded would take up the entire screen and a lot more. So it's in here somewhere. The entire test is taken from an online version of the test you can find for free and in the references of the community post. Um, so it's 300 questions. We've engineered it into a prompt that is fed through this LM evaluator function. Um, and the prompt starts with an optional personality prompt. So in the case of feeding this to one of our generated personas, we would insert into our call to LLM Big Five test um, like the data value from the persona data set, which would be the set of five randomly chosen prompts that would go in, and that would be your personality. The second part of the prompt is just this laundry list of 300 questions and directions to the LLM to answer them in a specific format. I think the format was repeat each question on a line, add a dash, and then print your one word answer, which is a sample of um, these right here. Convert. So I have this data set to convert answers from text to numerical. It's easier for ChatGPT to output kind of text answers. Also, the text answers mean things. So it's a list of 300 prompts. To each one, the computer replies one of these five: very inaccurate, moderately inaccurate, neither accurate nor inaccurate, moderately accurate, or very accurate. I threw moderate inaccurate and moderate accurate in there because on my first trial run, um, GPT-4o occasionally would return what was supposed to be a 2 or a 4 without the ly suffix on the end. It was just kind of a silly engineering challenge that I had to throw in there at the end. Excuse me. So now you have, so okay, so you feed all of this into your prompt. It's a very long prompt, and because you have to run this 30 times and it takes a long time to process and frankly a long time to output because it's a 300 line LLM response. Um, it takes quite a while. So we wrote this function to systematically feed it over the whole data set and return the value for each one. Now, we don't really want to deal with a data set of answers that is a bunch of words like very inaccurate, moderately inaccurate, etc. So that's why we have this answer scale conversion because computers are quite good with working with large vectors of numbers. So in this example, we have run an example LM Big Five test on this list of, or on just one personality that has this list of three traits, just as a toy example, not to run it too far. Um, and we wanted to convert their answers into a vector because that's way easier to work with, as long as we maintain that we have an association between the number one, for example, here to very inaccurate. So this is an example vector of an example test, just so you can kind of visualize what the data type is that we're working with. Um, I have also written this function, which we'll use later just for sort of better purposes of displaying the data in a way that makes sense, where you can pull from the personality example, like you can pull from this list a kind of neat list of the traits, and this orientation field represents whether or not it's supposed to be a high score or a low score, or a positive orientation towards imagination, lower negative orientation towards imagination. I realized after the fact that orientation was a terrible word to choose for this field because it doesn't really make that much intuitive sense. But um, at this point, I was kind of too far in to try something else. So orientation it is. Um,
Yeah,
so
it makes
after we
sense,
have
orientation towards, vulnerability, for instance. I guess
this, that
you're
was
just
my first,
you're
and that
just
was my
ranking
first
them.
inclination. But I'll move to this graph so you can kind of see
Hmm.
orientation doesn't necessarily make sense for all of these.
Oh,
Um, I don't think orientation towards like I don't know trust, anxiety, that felt a little. It just felt a little ungrammatical in my opinion. I don't like it very much, but it is the language that I myself used. So anyhow, so like you just kind of previewed on the original image and the graph below. Next thing you do is you want to make these into graphs so you can really kind of neatly see um, your results. So
do you ask all the questions in one prompt, or do you like so you have like your
I wanted to ask
personality?
them in one prompt
Uh-huh.
because I didn't want. Um, well, I was nervous about if you ask kind of targeted personality questions in separate prompts, then you might influence the model kind of between each query. And I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to kind of keep it as systematic as possible. Um, it's also much, much easier on the back end to do all of this like data manipulation interpretation if all of your results come out in one nice prompt where you can just pull the answer, convert it into a single vector. You don't have to do any sort of combination, anything like that.
Okay. Yeah. So you say like in and the prompt is like, okay, here's your personality, answer all these questions, and then it it does that. It does the rankings for each
Yes,
question.
right.
Okay.
It was all one giant. I mean, that's frankly why it took so long because each query was, I mean, like thousands of tokens going down
Yeah,
the
yeah.
entire list.
And so the
Um,
output was like, and it answered like all the questions in order.
yes, so we specified the output format because, again, if you're repeating this over, your entire data set of personalities, you want to keep the output format consistent so you can write nice functions that kind of convert everything in the same way. Um, and the output format that I used specifically was, again, repeat every question on its own line. And then after you repeat the question, print a dash character and then print your answer, which is selected from this list of answers. And then I gave that list of moderately inaccurate, neither inaccurate nor accurate, etc. Um, and so you got this nice, exactly 300 line output where every line was always the same, very systematic. Just printed the question, print a dash, print your answer, um, and that worked really, really well because it allowed us again to write sort of functions that really made the cleaning on the back end super, super easy. Um, and with that, we want to organize them into plots because as much as this format here makes it really, really nice and really, really easy to work with the numbers, it's not that intuitive. And looking at this just with the naked human eye, you can't really tell much about anything looking at that. So we compiled the results into this little chart. It's a stacked bar graph where like you saw earlier, all of the subcategories are stacked on top of one another within their, main category. And then with that, you can get kind of a general idea of which traits are high, which traits are low. This table I have just generated based on 300 random integers. This isn't actually any personality from an LLM. This is just for the sake of showing you that what this chart is, what it looks like, what it does. Um, Here is the example from earlier with just where was it? The three trait prompt, this one. These three traits, when run through, when you feed those three traits into the personality prompt part and then feed the 300 questions, you get kind of this graph, uh, which again just kind of shows you that the process is working. We're measuring these traits effectively, and our bar graph is kind of effectively capturing what we wanted to capture. So here is the baseline test, which is what you saw on
Can
the
you
first.
explain more that bar graph? So like there are six subcategories. Okay, so you tested one of the personalities, right? For this whole data set of questions, and this is how it's scored. Is
Yes.
that accurate?
So,
Okay.
well, we score it kind of. This is a visual representation of how it's scored.
Mm-hmm.
We score it by compiling. So each of the let's see if I go back up to the data set of where is it? I think it's the data set of people. So I want to go back up here. If I go back to our data set of people, um, all of these people have sort of five. Oop, I've scrolled over way too far. Have sort of five traits that are associated with them, and their personality is constructed on these five traits. Um, these five traits are going to influence their answers on the 300 question questionnaire. And so when they take the 300 question questionnaire, you get this 300 dimensional vector where each question, and because the questions are always fed in the same order, the questions all like you can associate any given position in this vector with a specific question. So um, I'll go over actually, probably the best way to show this is by sharing this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet also is listed in the sources on the community posts. But here, so you can see this full number. This is basically the index within the vector, the 300 dimensional vector of where each question slash prompt is. So, for example, the number one, the first question asked every time is worry about things. Like you worry about things. And then the LLM responds, worry about things dash very inaccurate, as if to say, I do not frequently worry about things. Um, and the same goes for the entire list of 300 questions. So I'm going to go back to the notebook. So the example LLM rated this question out of 5. And then we have a function
So
that
if the
compiles.
LLM, if one of the LLM personalities rated that question as 5, then that means that they very accurate to worry about things. So they're ranking high in neuroticism, I would imagine. Is that the takeaway
Yes. So this
from
this is a
from
this
that
is
one question?
right. So yes. The other I probably should have gone over these before. Um, the other parts of this spreadsheet are you have the number, you have the item, and then you also have a sign, a key, and a facet. So the sign is basically just the key with a positive or negative sign, which is my orientation category from earlier, which shows whether or not your design it's indicates a high level of this trait or a low level of this trait. Um, the,
Okay, so this is
the key,
positive in neuroticism, category 1.
right, right. So the
Okay.
key is the key is a letter and a number. The letter is one of the big five traits.
Hmm.
The one of the ocean traits. So it's convenient to refer to them as here because the key is N blank, E blank, O blank, A blank, or C blank. So it's one of those ocean categories. And then each letter has keys 1 through 6. And I believe each of the keys has it's either 2 or 4 or it's some standardized number of questions for each one. Um, where each of the sub traits, each of the sub traits has a couple of questions that are meant to measure them, and then we use the exact same algorithm for scoring as is recommended by the source, which is found in the spreadsheet, which is I'll highlight it here. Um, the scoring for each item, if it's a positive key, as in if it's meant to measure, as if the trait indicates, like answering high indicates that you are positively oriented to this trait. It's just the raw score. So the 5, the very accurate, implies that it would be very accurate that you exhibit this trait. And then there are reverse questions. Let me look for one. Here's a -1 right here. Um, Cautiousness. This question is measuring negative orientation to cautiousness, and the prompt is jump into things without thinking. So obviously, if you answer it's very accurate that you jump into things without thinking, well, you don't actually want that to score high for cautiousness, so you just reverse it. So a 5 score, you would just subtract from 6, and then you get a 1 score. So if you answer that it's very accurate that you jump into things without thinking. We want that to exhibit a negative in the cautiousness trait. So that's how the scoring works. Jump back over to the notebook unless anyone has anything else on the scoring.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the bar chart doesn't have like negative values on it. I guess
So the
it's
the way the way the bar chart works, because and the reason it doesn't have negative values is because if you are negatively orienting like a trait, so if you
then that would mean something
answer
comes out to 0.
right. It'll well, it'll never be less than 0 because of the way we score it. Input if a score of or sorry, a response of very accurate is always 5. Like that is the value 5. Um, for questions that are meant to measure positive orientation towards a certain trait, that score is input into our results calculator, which is basically just a string of additions and subtractions between all of the questions for each subtrait. Um, if if the question is meant to measure positive orientation, that 5 is just inputted as 5. If a question is meant to measure negative orientation toward a trait, that 5 instead goes in as 6 minus 5, or I guess more generally, that x goes in as 6 minus x. So if it's very accurate to a trait or to a question that measures negative orientation towards a trait, then instead of going in as a 5, it goes in as a 1.
I see.
So what you end up getting with that is that no matter whether the question is addressed to be negative or positive orientation toward a certain trait, it's all scored such that more points are added if you have a more positive orientation. And the way you get that from negative oriented questions is just by flipping the answer from 5 to
Okay,
1
so saying
to
like in this second thing is saying it's not very extroverted. So saying it's
right.
not extroverted saying is equivalent to saying it ranks low in extroversion.
Yes,
Okay.
correct. Um, which is basically just this saying that in aggregate it's low negatively oriented to extroversion, but it is that way because it is very low cheerfulness, very low excitement seeking, very low activity level, yada yada yada. All of the traits that make up extroversion as a category are low or relatively low. I think in this case they're all pretty low. I guess this randomly generated sample of a couple prompts was pretty targeted towards being low in these categories. But you can also start to see kind of residual effects, even if you have um, a prompt that's specifically targeted to be low in extroversion. It also hits self-discipline, achievement striving, adventurousness, stuff like that. So we'll get more into that later, but you can kind of see the beginning of these residual effects that I think warrant a good amount of future study. So we move on to the baseline test. The baseline test, this is basically just kind of the back end like data set representation of the graph that you saw at the beginning, which was the stacked bar chart for baseline ChatGPT. Just taking this without any personality prompt whatsoever. Um, and so this is how it's structured. You have a name field. I called this one baseline, but usually it would be the keys that are generated when you generated the data set, just a randomly generated Wolfram name entity generation function generates these kind of funny names. But I just called this one baseline. Test scores. Each of these are keys, like you saw from the spreadsheet. We use the exact same key identification where N1, for example, would be neuroticism, the first trait, which I imagine based on this trait, this chart is anxiety. Um, so, N1, you have this is your total score, and this is the answer vector, which I don't think that these are actually like stacked such that the N1 test or N1 answer scores are on this line. The addition doesn't make sense. This is just the kind of 300 dimensional vector, like, just vomited onto this data set. But you get the kind of the nice representation of the scores in this column where you can kind of clearly see uh, all the scores for each of the traits. And then based on this chart, um, you throw in, you basically we have a function that converts this into a nice little graphic. I spent a very long time figuring out the best color scheme for this. This is the one I settled on. I don't know if it's really that good or not, but
I
I
like
decided
it.
to stop worrying about it. Um, and so it stacks them up in groups and you can kind of view them very nicely. I skipped over these two because these are not relevant specifically for the baseline. The trait summary is what I showed you earlier, where based on the prompts, the function will reference the data set of all the prompts, and it can give you a nice sort of summary of plus this, minus this, as in positively oriented towards this, negatively oriented towards this. And then the personality prompts is just a list of those 5 prompts that were compiled into one to be fed into the LLM. Um, when we get into some of the examples where they actually have engineered personalities and names, this column will be different because it'll be a real name. And then the trait summary will be important because it gives us a nice way to kind of display next to the chart what traits exactly are being measured. But obviously this isn't important for the baseline because we didn't give any personality prompts. So that's why these are empty on this example. So now the last kind of part of this section is we want to test our generated personalities. So I've exported the name of our saved data set, which I have saved in a file on my computer, back in here, so you can kind of see the exact same results that you would find on the community post paper. Um, so what are we looking at here? Same as the same as the data set up here with the baseline. You have your name key. These are all randomly generated by the random entity generation function. So you have your name. This one is Nubia. You have all your test scores, which are stored in this column. Apparently, Nubia is pretty high in this trait, pretty low in this trait. Um, but more importantly, and really, really interesting so you can actually visualize the results. You get this summary of what traits are actually being measured. So that's what I was explaining above. Um, so that's how we calculate kind of all of the results. And then in this next in this section 4 at the end, um, I'll kind of show off the plots for all 30 of the personalities, and when we get to the community graph, it's keyed really nicely so that when you hover your mouse over any of the dots, its plot comes up and its list of trait comes up, and you can kind of see, like, you can get a general feel for how graph shapes are clustering together. Um,
Yeah.
so
How many questions are in the data set? 300.
Yes, it's a 300 question. I like the word question isn't exactly right because as you could see from if you recall from the spreadsheet, most of the prompts aren't actually questions. They're more like I explained it in the prompt as you'll be given a list of traits or scenarios, rate them by the level, the extent to which you identify with them, some language like that. But yeah, so it's 300 of those.
Uh-huh. Right. So, yeah, there were like different items. It's like rank how you are on, this thing. Or if there's
Yes.
like what kind of scenarios are there? Like if Jimmy takes your lunch money, do you plot revenge
None
and
of
tie your
none of
shoelaces together or something?
none
Or,
of the scenarios like that. If you jump over back to the spreadsheet, this has them nicely listed out. So these are all of the traits in this E category. So am afraid of many things, feel sympathy for those who are worse off than myself. It's 300 of these. Hold a grudge is one that I is one that I think is interesting to ask an LLM. Uh, so it's 300 prompts like these. There,
Mhm.
I was struggling to find a word for it, so I just used a bunch of words and figured it would kind of encapsulate all of them enough for the LM to understand what it was doing. Um,
And
but
so
that is kind of the full data set.
there are 10 questions targeting each subcategory.
I think it is 10. That the math makes sense if it's 10. So
Yeah.
uh, I'm gonna assume it's 10. That is probably correct. So each one has 10 questions associated with it. I would guess, I didn't actually look and confirm this. I would guess that it's 5 positive and 5 negative, although that's not necessarily the case. And it doesn't matter because the function that we use to score it, it automatically detects based on the key in the data set whether or not it is positive or negative. So um, even if it were 6 and 4, for example, the function would still score it accordingly. So, but
And
I would imagine it's for clarity. Yeah.
I have one more question. Then Damaris has a question. I was wondering when you prompt the personality, do you give it like five prompts saying like, oh, you rank high, you give it a sentence saying like blah blah blah, which is you're trying to like nudge it to say you rank high in neuroticism and you rank low in consciousness or something like that. Is it five for each? Is that how you're doing it, or you're targeting specific
Yes. So
subcategories?
if we come back up here, this is our data set for our personality prompts, which are randomly selected from the data set. Sorry, this is our data set for each personality and their prompts, which is in each personality is run through a function which randomly selects 5 prompts from the list of 60 because it's 30 traits times 2 because each trait has 2 prompts, one for positive, one for negative. Also, there's a check to ensure that one personality does not get the positive and negative prompt for the same trait. And so your personalities are five randomly selected traits from that list of 60. And the way that's input in the prompt is they're all smushed together in one string. And then they're inputted in that section of the LLM function in the Wolfram language. So you can look here. I mentioned this earlier. The way we got these prompts is on a document that I unfortunately cannot share on the stream for some reason. The results calculator for the online version of this test gives you a verbal description of each of the traits and like what they're actually measuring because some of them are kind of a little bit opaque as to what they're measuring. Like, for example, there's a trait that measures liberalism, but it's not like political liberalism. It's psychological liberalism, which has its own definition,
I
and
see.
that is described in the paper. So the way I got the list of 60 prompts is I took these descriptions straight from that paper. Didn't want to inject any of my bias as someone with a not a very deep psychological background. So I took the description straight from that paper, and all I did was rework them into second person statements, like you see here, like you are sensitive about what others think about them. I imagine that the verbal description of that trait, whichever trait this is. I imagine the description of that from the research was people who are blank are sensitive about what others think about them, yada yada yada. And so all I did was rework those descriptions into second person direct statements directed to the LLM, so that it would kind of be a signal to okay adapt this personality. But like the word like the names of the traits are not involved anywhere in the prompt because that's kind of circular if you're trying to give
Right.
LLMs prompts like you are neurotic and then you measure it for neuroticism. Like in theory, it's a little bit circular because if psychology has deemed that these are the traits that kind of compile and create neuroticism, then you would expect giving them these traits indicates neuroticism. But it's not kind of direct like cheating, saying like you are neurotic, answer accordingly. You're kind of engineering like more like a real person, a real personality that kind of has these actual traits rather than trying to induce them via like very targeted language.
Right, right. Well, it doesn't seem like the prompts were saying like asking about the category that they're targeted for. Also, like
Can you explain that a little bit more? What do you mean by that?
like can you go back to the questions quickly?
Yes.
Um, the spreadsheet.
Oh,
Right. So, um, the top one here, E5, that's extroversion. Is that right? And you don't
E5
see like
extroversion specifically, E5 refers to excitement seeking, but the E refers to extroversion.
I see.
Um,
So extroversion, excitement
Excitement
seeking,
seeking is a
and
subtrait of extroversion,
s-
according to this test.
right. So I don't see like on line 92 like anxiety, right? Neuroticism, but the anxiety and neuroticism are not in the question statement prompt.
Right.
Okay.
That's by design.
Yeah.
That would be, if I was ever taking a personality test and one of the questions was, are you neurotic? I would probably stop taking that personality test. I don't expect to get very much out of that. Like you're supposed to tell me that
Right, right, right.
based on
So,
questions.
so these personalities, basically you have five categories. Each category has six subcategories. Um, and then there are 30 like traits, and you have a binary choice on those 30 items. So you pick like randomly like um, binary values for all those 30 items and like feed that in the prompt to the personality. Is that how you're constructing your personalities?
Yes. It's a well, so you take a binary choice of a choice of five of the 30. We because you don't want to input
Okay.
uh, a personality that has, a positive or negative orientation for all of the traits, because then it, then it gets kind of, you would expect like very sort of binary results where you either measure like 10 for a category, like a really low score, or you measure 50, like the highest score for every single one. And that's not really realistic, you know?
Right.
You kind of want, and it's also more interesting that way to give them just a couple, because then, uh, and I hope to do this in the future, do a study with a lot more personalities. And when you only touch like five, you get this really interesting look at what affects other things. Because it's not always that, affecting one trait in neuroticism increases every other trait in neuroticism. You can have interplay between traits from different of the major big five categories.
Hmm.
And those would be very interesting to study because it would help you kind of more efficiently engineer the personalities. For example, if you knew that, uh, just to use these ones as an example, if you knew that high intellect correlated with high modesty, like personalities that were given high intellect prompts also demonstrated high modesty on average, then you could kind of roll those traits into one and say, if I want to affect both of these things positively, then I can do this. I can do this with a shorter prompt because I only have to affect one. Or if you wanted a system that was high intellect and low modesty, okay, well, I have to explicitly prompt both of these traits. So studying the interplay between all of them helps kind of solve a couple engineering challenges down the road. If you wanted to use this as a framework for like engineering personalities so that they would perform better at specific things.
Right, right. Okay. Damaris, go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke. I unfortunately missed the first part of your presentation, so I don't know if you already talked about this, but it's kind of about this. Basically, my question is exactly about that circularity. Currently, the way you've set it up, aren't you just validating that the way you designed your prompts is in line with the big five, right? Because you took the big five, you were like, let me use other words, made them as prompt, ran them through the test, and you got the traits back. But isn't that just validating your prompts and not necessarily validating
Yes.
that you can do personality analysis?
Yes, and you're not entirely wrong. And I will tell you the part that you missed was kind of at the beginning. I gave like a very high level overview of where I eventually wanted this project to go. It's much bigger than just kind of, you know, giving personality tests to LLMs. And one of the things I mentioned there was about personality engineering for systems that if you could predict based on a personality what kind of decisions it would make, and by it I mean an AI LLM agent system. If you can use aspects of its personality to predict what kind of decisions it would make, what its behavior would be like, well, that's powerful, and that's something that we want to explore. What I mentioned at the beginning is that this project is just a really, really small first step towards that. So in a way, you're kind of right, and that was honestly the goal. It's okay that the test seems a little circular because realistically, I just wanted to validate that I wouldn't be wasting my time trying to, personality test these LLMs if my test wasn't any good. So it was an important first step. And I'm just kind of going a step by step through how I got to this small little point. But it is not lost on me that as a scientific body of research, a test where I explicitly prompt certain traits to be high or low, and then measure those same traits being high or low, that's not really groundbreaking. But which you're right to point out. The point is that it's possible to prompt specific personality into an LLM and then measure it again. So I think
Gotcha.
I'll get in now to a little bit of the long-term vision, why that's kind of
Yeah.
super important. So say you're a company investing in AI agents that sell for you, AI salespeople. If you deploy a couple of different models, a couple different, you prompt engineer or just use different, models like, different model companies, like you use Gemini here and chat here, whatever, and you realize that you have one specific agent that's performing really, really well, well, what I have just shown is that uh, you can give that agent, you can give your LLM this test, and it will kind of accurately break down the personality traits according to the Big Five test. I've just shown basically that the test captures what we want it to. So if you notice that one of your agents is particularly good at selling, you can kind of break that personality down. And since you know that based on this project that you can re-engineer personalities with kind of targeted prompting, you can prompt your other agents that are selling things with a personality that matches the one that's performing very well. And in theory, what I would like to develop research further into whether or not this is true, in theory, you could replicate that success by replicating the successful agent's personality across other agent deployments. So you're correct that like as a science, this isn't particularly interesting or fruitful, but it is a good kind of engineering sanity check that ensures that the prompts we're giving it are reflecting in their answers to these personality questions, which in theory should reflect on their behavior, although that remains something that I would like to study further.
I see. And sorry, second part would be what you just mentioned about some of the dimensions being entangled, like intellect and modesty. But from what I understand from the history of the Big Five, now this is for the Big Five, I'm not sure about these 30, is that they were designed to be not overlapping. Like that's literally the idea behind them. But you're seeing entanglement there.
So I'm not sure. I only mentioned that because it's obviously when you get to the examples, which we will, when you get to the examples, you don't. It's not like every single trait that you. It's not like every single bar graph that you see is where every block is kind of the same except for five that are particularly low or particularly high, which indicates to me that although they are like, and I know that history actually. I think you were the one that enlightened me of that history at some point during the summer school. But what you'll see when you look at these graphs is that they are entangled a little bit. They're designed not to be entangled, but just the data and the results that I'm looking at indicate that they are, to whatever extent, to varying extents across different examples. But you'll see like what you would expect if they weren't entangled at all, 0% entangled, would be that all of your graphs, you would kind of have, I guess, depending on the trait, I think, average just middle ground score would be 25 or 35, something in that range. If they weren't entangled at all, you would expect to see that 25 of the 30 traits would be somewhere in that very middle range. And then the 5 traits that were targeted would be particularly high up there in the 40s, 45, up to 50. And then the ones that were targeted to be negative would be very low, down in like, 10 to 20. But you don't see that. So that's my evidence for saying that they are entangled, although I am aware that the test was designed psychologically such that the traits aren't entangled. But
I can comment on that a
Minimally, I
little
guess.
bit.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, James.
Yeah, so the factors are not designed. It's an empirical analysis that's a factorization of clustering of what appears to be 5 separate traits. So basically, it's just a spread of all different directions that answers to these questions can take in a space. And they seem to cluster around 5 specific points. In some societies, there's actually a 6th trait. So it's not given that there are 5. It just so happens that there tends to be 5 amongst most societies that have been tested. The other thing, these are self-reported answers. So you're answering for yourself. So that's another factor here where it's actually the fact that you're asking the LLM for its responses. That's what we do for humans to find the same thing. So it's an interesting backstory to actually look at why that is the case. But it makes sense that there is an effect, because if there is a specific question or trait here that kind of like is very close between the two factors, then it will have a slight influence between them. Likewise, if there's one that's maybe in the middle of all 5 factors, then it'll have a slight influence on all 5 factors.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's certainly fleshed out in the examples that we'll get to in a second. Should I keep going then? Any more questions as of right now?
Yeah, keep going.
All
Interesting.
right. So I think we were here looking at the computing results into a personality vector. So originally, I'll bring this back up just for the sake of seeing it. Originally, you had this 300 dimensional vector, and then I refer to this as the answer vector in my paper or in the community post, and above and below this point in the notebook in the presentation. You can, because the big 5 traits, or I guess the big 5 traits, as in all 30 of the subtraits, are kind of set to be, they are kind of like individual. You can reduce this vector into 30 dimensions by just compiling all the answers together in this like test scores vector, where it just makes the math a little bit simpler. Instead of doing it, you can do it both ways, and I have plots below for both. But instead of measuring, all 300 dimensions, you can measure just in the 30 dimensions, where each kind of index of the vector is one of the traits rather than one of the questions. I only point that out because it's part of the section that we use and kind of compare. I'll shut this off, and that we use to compare. And we compare the 30-dimensional vectors and the 300-dimensional vectors as sort of a sanity check to how useful both of them are. And there isn't really that much of a difference, but you'll be able to see that when I get to those plots. So the way we compute those results is based on, I have here this Excel file that I have been showing you kind of throughout the presentation, which shows the scoring mechanism, and it shows all of the prompts, all of the questions. And so I was talking earlier about the function that would input like the sign. Instead of positive or negative, we have 1 and -1, which just makes the math a lot easier because you can multiply. You can use 1 and -1 as multipliers, and it makes the number super easy to add up into those composite scores. And so I have this, you can see if you wanted to, the code is also here. It's also hidden under kind of drop boxes in the community post if you want to look at it. It's just kind of some like regular expression tomfoolery, and then the math using the sign to turn it into, whether the positively oriented 5, you multiply it by a positive sign, or the negatively oriented one, which you would subtract, which you can see kind of there in the score category for that. And then, at the end, it all looks like this, which you have already seen up in some of the bigger data sets, which I have to hide that, which are hidden in there. But this is just kind of an example of one isolated on its own. Again, this is just this isn't an actual test. This is just random 300 random integers from 1 to 5 used to compile this whatever score. And so I think what should answer some of these questions, I'll get into some of these result plots. So the first plot, which is what you've been kind of seeing the whole time, are these bar graphs, which, and as I mentioned, now that we are actually working with personalities from the data set, we have this nice labeling system. You have your name key and a list of all the traits that are being measured by each personality. So the bar graphs, you've been looking at them kind of the whole presentation. It's basically just these composite scores for each trait stacked on top of each other based on their letter, based on which of the big 5 traits they are a subtrait for. And so with these, I'll just scroll through them a little bit. You can see that there is a good deal of variation across different personalities. The traits are reflecting in sort of the results. And again, you get a lot of interesting, and you can see some of that interplay. Damaris' question was targeted towards that there's only 5 traits here, but there's definitely more than 5 categories that are affected to be very high. Like you have sympathy at 47 is obviously targeted here. But low modesty at 18 is not targeted anywhere in this prompt, yet, you see a very low score for modesty and relatively higher scores across other personalities. Like this one is a 32. That's kind of a middle ground for modesty. And there's so many different interplays you can look at between all of these different results. But the point of going through all of them kind of in this quick way is just that you can see that there very much is kind of a broad spectrum of differences that goes beyond the slate of 5 traits that are affected.
Just a quick question about that.
Sure.
Since you're only prompting for 5 and 2 or 3 of them might fall into the same big category. I think you had like extroversion, like adventurousness and excitement seeking in one of them, if I saw that correctly.
Probably.
Then you're basically not asking any questions about anything else, right? So you would have one of the big 5 traits run on empty, but you must get results because there must be answers to these questions. Did you ever
Yes.
try filtering those out? Because I mean, I'm assuming they're just random artifacts. They should be random artifacts at that point, except of course the correlations are actually very strong. Like, is there a way to test for that?
I imagine there would be in the time and resource constraints. It's something I wanted to look at and still want to look at, but the time and resource constraints didn't really let me target specifically like engineer personalities that kind of like take one trait from each of them, or maybe at most like cap the number of traits you can take from one of the big 5 at 2 or something like that. So there's a million different things you could do to kind of specifically engineer personalities that might tell you something interesting about like the nature of the test or the nature of LLMs or the nature of prompt engineering with personalities. There are a million different things you can use to study. But really, all that my project as of right now, or I guess I should say as of the end of Wolfram Summer School, is I've kind of just developed this pipeline for administering a personality, administering a test, and then just proving that the traits that are captured, at the very minimum, the traits that are captured in the prompt are caught by the test and measured accurately as we would expect them to be. In terms of looking at how those traits affect other traits that aren't targeted, that is research that remains to be done and something I definitely want to look at. Because again, if you think of that like long-term vision of being able to engineer personalities that are good at certain things or reverse engineer personalities that are good at certain things, then that would be very helpful to know just for the sake of efficiency and for the sake of, so every time you're putting a targeted piece into your prompt, what the downstream effects are of putting that in. So it's interesting, and I want to look into it more. But at this specific moment in time, I wish I could tell you more about specific kind of interplay, but I'm not there yet.
Okay,
In
cool,
the
thanks.
cycle of this research. It's a good question though, because
So this is very interesting. Can you scroll through these kind of slowly, or for instance, this one at the top here. So, oh, whoops.
move on. Yeah. Oh,
Just let's go to the top.
let's go all the way to the top. Here we go.
Okay. So, excitement seeking. You said in the trait to have a negative. You prompted it to be negatively scoring
Yes.
on the excitement seeking, and
Right.
it also scored low on everything in that extroversion category.
Yes.
Okay. And You told it to be have rank well with imagination, and that's in what category? The
Imagination, I believe, is in openness to experience.
okay.
Yes.
And so it ranked high on all of those, pretty well, except for adventurousness, which
Yes.
I
Which
guess
interestingly was not targeted in the traits.
but adventurousness and excitement seeking are sort of like
Right.
correlated as subcategories, I would say, possibly. So they
Yes.
kind of
But interestingly, according to the Big Five, they're not part of the same. They're not part of the same one of the Big Five traits. So you know, these like there are, you know, probably millions of these little interactions um, that are remain to be discovered or probed that you could target in theory using a bunch of the functions that I kind of worked on. It'll
Yeah.
be really interesting to keep doing things like that and looking at like specifically what the associations are between each of these traits.
Yeah, I
Uh,
wanted to also just mention here there's it seems like a little bit ambiguous sometimes with how these things are named, and that's because um, the names we give what comes out from the data is totally subjective. So what we're defining here as intellect is just what appears to be something that might be intellect. You might be able to call it something else. Ultimately, it's just a decomposition of what the factorization is. So, you know, over time, some of those even changed. Like what we initially thought was, what is it here? It's like maybe, was it like openness to experience? Like some people would call that like there's a very high correlation to intellect. So maybe initially somebody would say, okay, well, that's just like IQ or something like that. But then it changes over time. You can basically call it whatever you want. It just seems to be that if you extract that factor and you talk to people who have a very high allocation to that factor, it appears that you could call it that thing. So it's just, yeah, to understand how these descriptions are arrived. It's just by looking at the data and comparing it to how humans act.
Fair enough. Yeah. So if you wanted to kind of if you wanted to be more specific about them, I suppose you could refer to them just as like, you know, O1, O2, O3, but we do have names for them, which is and that's how I got the prompts as well, if you remember, as I just, you know, engineered the descriptions of what each of these means according to this specific test. Just kind of engineered them into second person statements that you could give to an LLM.
so what came first, the questions or these categories?
No, the questions.
Oh, the questions came first.
No, the questions came first. Yeah. So basically, there was just like a large sample of questions that were asked. There was no design in terms of how these were going to be categorized at all initially. And then they just they asked thousands of people these questions. They accumulated all the data and they noticed that you could decompose and factor the results of those questions. That's how they started labeling what the results were. So there was no idea how many factors were going to come out. There could have been 10, it could have been 6, who knows? I think initially there were a lot more. Like they found about 12 factors, roughly speaking. And then they did like more and more statistics and decompositions in different ways, and they ended up at 5. So 5 was the most robust factor analysis on the results. But that's what makes the Big Five completely different to any other personality test, is that it was derived empirically. We had no idea what was going to come out of the data.
I don't think that's quite correct, though. From what I've been reading, is more so that somebody went through a dictionary. It was a lexical approach. So somebody went through a dictionary back in the 50s or something, and like took out all the traits of humans. It was like in the 10,000s, like whittled it down, you know, had other people help them, especially, you know, kicking out the ones that are not relevant anymore, some that are never used, and so on. And with this lexical approach, they got it down to, I don't know, a dozen or a few dozen, and then started empirical testing on correlations and trying to find the ones that are the most loading and the most uncorrelated as possible. But the original approach was a lexical one, where you would go and try to kind of like guess, okay, well, what might we want to test for in the first place? And then use empirical data in order to really find the ones that are the most helpful on that.
That's interesting.
Which
I
it's
mean,
still valid, but in a way, it's always the big five is always to a degree tautological. It was literally designed to catch humans in the most, in clusters that are the most telling, but it was designed to do so. So I don't know. I'm a little iffy on this test, personally.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a psychologist. I'm interested in psychology to the extent that it applies to this research. Although I do know that whatever you say about the derivation of this test, like there are there is evidence. I don't know, the extent to which I can trust this evidence. Again, I'm not a particularly particularly well-versed scholar of psychology. But there is evidence to suggest that, however derived, the measurement of these personality traits can predict like certain affinity for certain things. I forget which one, but there is I think perhaps it's conscientiousness that predicts career success. There's a certain amount of evidence that suggests that's true. And so, like, if you can predict the macro traits, you may be able to predict micro behavior, maybe not as it applies to humans, but maybe as it applies to LLMs, which would be interesting nonetheless. And again, I should bring this up again, Damaris, because you might have missed this at the beginning. Um, I asserted that, in my opinion, having worked with this test and having done this project, I think if I find that the test is actually, above random chance at predicting kind of, affinity for certain tasks, my intuition is that you could probably devise a test better than this specifically for the purposes of measuring LLMs. Uh, I don't think there's anything particularly special about the Big Five test as it specifically applies to computers. There's psychological, years of psychological work that disagree with me as it applies to humans, but as it applies to computers, I think you may, just because there are certain quirks in LLMs and just computer thinking in general that humans kind of don't have. So my intuition is that if this works, it might be worth the time and effort to develop a test kind of engineered for LLMs as a prediction of like performance on certain tasks. So um, I'm not particularly married to the reputation of the Big Five test, even as it pertains to this project. It was just kind of a very interesting, um, it was just a sort of a very interesting framework that already existed for analyzing this stuff. So um, I'll keep moving through these. I guess I'll go slower in case you catch one that's
I
particularly
mean, so like
interesting.
in my mind, so these big five are the big five test. I mean, it's like the statistical thing, and they have these categories, by way of testing like certain cultures or societies. And are they are these categories supposed to be independent, more or less?
Someone might be actually able to answer this better than me.
Uh,
Like I think
James, I mean, is that
you,
what you
you
were
mean
saying earlier?
you mean any of the
No, no, I'm
30
saying
subjects?
so Damaris is correct. The history is lexical based. But what I'm trying to say is that the I mean, like, it becomes a discussion about how this thing was actually derived. But the point is, there was a bunch of data collected. They analyzed the data and they found that that there was clustering around specific results. So as I mentioned initially, there were more than five just looking at the data. There was like maybe 12, 10, and they whittled it down. Some researchers found 8. But then the most robust statistical analysis was about 5, and then that carried forward. But the point is that it's just like if you just have a data plot. So imagine a data plot, and there's lots of points on that data plot, but they sort of cluster around 5 areas, and they drew a circle around that little cluster, and they said, okay, well, there's something here. So then they looked at the types of responses, and they said, okay, well, the way that people answered those questions within that clustering tended to be what you would call something like neurotic. But maybe that wasn't the word they used initially. It's like maybe they're shy, maybe they're like nervous, oh, neuroticism. That's a good word to capture the kind of questions that were asked there. and then that's how neuroticism became a factor.
Okay.
So yeah.
So like in my mind, I think like if I was like stressed all the time, just stressed, like if I had a high propensity to be neurotic, then I would be less trusting of others and would have trouble like making friends or something like that.
Potentially, but I mean that's
Hypothetically.
like that's like a psychological analysis of what you're saying there. What this test is doing is just looking at the data. It's just looking
Yeah.
at the data.
But then like correlation, like what's the cause of this thing, that in my mind would be like I mean, that's a psychological question.
Yeah, exactly. So then you have to like plan anthropological like analysis on top of the data. So like for example, what Luke was talking about with prediction of success in career is like very high conscientiousness, relatively high open to experience, somewhat low neuroticism, and then for sales, particularly like high agreeableness tends to be like very good. But that's just looking at people who perform well, seeing what their big five is, and then finding that that is the result. So that's how it works. And then what's interesting with that is it's not even that straightforward, because if you look at like upper management and people who are in like strategic decision making scenarios, slightly lower conscientiousness is actually better. So it's almost like if you just do what you're told all the time, that's high conscientiousness, you can do well up to a certain level, to the point where you don't have anyone telling you what to do. You have to think for yourself, kind of thing. So, but again, that's just an interpretation.
Right.
But yeah, to your question, Dugan, about correlations. So this test is just a symptom clustering. So you get zero explanation of what is actually happening, why it's happening, what's going on. You're just saying, oh, look, this person is successful when they have this trait, just purely symptomatic. And yes, because of that, there is, so they were designed in a way that they, are as independent as possible. But that as possible is really important. Like they're not completely independent. For that, we would actually have to know what creates these symptoms in the first place, which we don't. So there is always a bit of correlation. And then I don't know if Lucas is going to talk about that, but yeah, if you look at only salespeople, you'll probably see that the clusters start like collapsing into like more broad, stuff always reappears. Like, okay, for this type of people, these supposedly independent things like start going together, but that's because it's a biased sample. So there's a lot of things here going on that can, that your results cannot necessarily tell you, because you would have to look at what type of data, was it biased, how big was the sample size, like which culture and so on, because it's just a symptomatic clustering.
I definitely agree with that. Well, which is kind of why I don't like particularly treat this product with like any sort of like super high level of like, I don't really like venerate the sanctity of the Big Five test or anything. It's crude for talking about humans, but it is a nice sort of scientific baseline for me to go off of to even begin looking at this question. Um, I won't probably look specifically. Nothing in this project I have, in this notebook I have specifically pertains to looking at performance on certain tasks. Again, that's just kind of like that was my vision for this project originally. This is just laying the groundwork for saying that you can't administer a test like this. You can measure it, and at least in albeit a somewhat circular way, it does seem like you can accurately measure what is supposed to be measured by this test. I think
Yeah,
it's
so I mean,
particularly
like
interesting.
here the question is, did the LLM come out with the personality that was prompted for?
Right. That's kind of that was sort of the central question, because in order to figure out if you can prompt an LLM to assume a personality that is, hypothetically useful or makes you more, or gives you a higher affinity for a certain task, well, then the first step of that is, okay, well, is the LLM actually going to be the personality I tell it to be? Seems like the answer to that is probably yes. I think the prompts that are given to it, and you can feel free to disagree, I guess. the prompts that I've fed to it, I think are disambiguated enough from like the traits that, they're all based on descriptions of the traits, which like as we've kind of just talked about are kind of vaguely identified anyway, sort of through these like, reverse engineered like lexical means. So I think because of that, the prompts are enough like removed from the actual measurement that it seems like they are capturing kind of what we want them to capture. And whether or not the big question this entire idea hinges on is will LLMs like humans have a higher affinity for certain things based on their quote unquote personality? And that question remains to be answered. Um, I think maybe if it's true for humans, it might be true for LLMs. It might not be true. But all of these questions, which are great questions and things that I've been thinking about personally for, since I finished the project, um, all of these questions kind of hinge on this like baseline step of can I prompt engineer personality in LLMs, and then can I measure it? And then it seems like that answer is probably yes as of right now. So all these interesting questions are things that I want to get to. Now I feel more confident that I can get to them given this was successful and I was able to create this sort of pipeline for prompt personality engineering and measuring. So um, the rest of what I have in this notebook is sort of just kind of different toy experiments with them. I guess you can consider this as sort of a toy experiment. You just kind of looked at you can just kind of compare all of the personalities at once. You can just see that these like cross trait uh, relationships exist. But there's not enough examples to systematically study those. And then at the bottom here, again, I can stop if you want to look at any of these, particularly if you find them interesting. Um, at the bottom here, I have flattened two-dimensional feature space plot for the answer vectors. So remember that's the 300-dimensional one, and then under that I have the personality vectors, or I think I refer to them up here as the test score vectors.
But what two
Um,
dimensions are being plotted here?
this is just it's just a dimensionality reduction
Okay.
PCA from
Yeah.
30 into 2 and 300 into 2 up here. Um, And realistically, these don't tell you that much. I have kind of I'll talk about this case later, and then I have these clustering plots below. Um, you
So
can't really
is the
tell.
goal for like this dimension reduction like to have two axes where the scatter is mostly random, so that you have like
So
independent things?
so realistically, I think the best way to actually look at kind of relationships between between personalities is with these plots down here, these like community clustering plots. The real reason I did this, and this is kind of, and these do look sort of random and they're kind of scattered all over the place, not really a lot of discernible trends. The reason I did this was actually to compare the sort of efficacy of the answer vectors and the score vectors, because it's, I think it's kind of important just as a practical matter of engineering that the 30-dimensional version of the vector and the 300-dimensional version of the vector say more or less the same thing. Um, because if they didn't, that would kind of be problematic. Um, and I think more or less it does, obviously because they're different, like a lot of the points end up in sort of different spots, but it's almost like it's almost like a rotation sort of the of this the score vector plot is almost like a rotation of sorts of the answer vector plot. So I mean, just as a pure example, if you look at 2 points here of Sylvia and Petey, they're roughly equidistant to each other in the answer vector plot as they are in the score vector plot. They're just kind of oriented differently. What exactly these orientations mean, I don't know, and it's hard to say because the dimensionality reduction takes a lot of the layers out of it. But
Yeah.
I think this was basically just a litmus to say like, okay, our answer vector, which is smaller, more lightweight, or sorry, our test score vector, which is smaller, more lightweight, is basically capturing kind of the same the same relationships between points. So that's kind of the only reason I have these in here. You can't really tell that much by looking at them. And anything you would hope to tell by them, I think, is shown much clearer in the cluster community graphs I have at the bottom. I did briefly. Oh, go for it.
Sure. Did you by chance try, or would that even make sense to try a normalized distance between all of them to see if that is the same in both of those graphs?
I did not try that. But realistically, I kind of threw these in just for because this is the only exception to this rule. Everything except these plots, I think, are somewhere in the community post. This isn't. This is an idea I think I might have toyed with at the time, but I thought of this sort of recently, just like if I'm going to use both of these, I should probably check to see if they're relatively the same. But that's a good idea, and I should try that, and I probably will do that after this is over. um, but yeah, I basically just a rough, visual comparison. Like, are things roughly sort of in the same spot, or are they some kind of, linear combination of where they were before, and are they, roughly equidistant? Do these points seem roughly equidistant to each other on both? So no, I didn't try that, but it is a good idea that I probably should play with. So before I get to the last thing, which is these interesting sort of clustering plots, I wanted to bring up this interesting case, and I realized when I saw this that I was actually very fortunate to have randomly generated a personality minimal pair in a sample of only 30 personalities. Um, I think the chances of that seem kind of low, but if you compare these two personalities, they differ in only one trait. And there's a bunch of interesting things that come with that. I think, let's see, the difference here is this one is plus liberalism and this one is plus immoderation, but the other four are the same orientation nonetheless and the same trait. And so it's kind of interesting to see this, like you have this minimal pair. What is changing just this one thing in two kind of different directions actually due to your graph. And I think this is an interesting route to potentially explore in future research, kind of intentionally generating minimal pairs like this. I guess with four randomly chosen ones that will stay constant, and then one that will change in some random direction. But I just thought this was kind of interesting. Um, I think I keep changing every time the way I pronounce that first one. I think right now I'm on Anali. You may have a different interpretation of that. And then Jonathan at the bottom, just these two randomly generated personalities that happen to be a minimal pair with just one differing factor. And it's interesting because there are clear differences, like extroversion is clearly quite different. And which is not one of the traits that is affected technically on the side. But more or less, they're kind of similar in shape. The neuroticism is relatively high compared to most of the other personalities. Conscientiousness are relatively low, although for Jonathan, it's a little bit higher across the board. Opposite is true for extroversion. This one's a little bit higher, but they're kind of in the same ballpark. So you can see that like personalities prompted with similar traits are similar, but even just the adjustment of one kind of does have a bunch of downstream effects beyond just changing that one factor. So I just thought this was a really interesting example to kind of see, just to put it out explicitly for anybody watching. For you to look at.
I have a question for that
Sure.
that is super fascinating. Now, extroversion, that dimension explicitly does not have a trait represented in the original prompt, but it is one of the most affected ones from, I think, what you said.
Right.
What does it tell us?
So what does that tell us? I think it tells us, maybe it tells us something about extroversion as a category, but I think more interesting to me because I bring this up both as a point of pain and a point of interest because, having seen this example after already generating them, I thought like to myself, I should have generated a lot more minimal pairs, on purpose. But like it is really interesting that the only I think that you are correct. This is probably the only of the big five that doesn't explicitly have a trait prompted. It is quite interesting. That's the one that's most affected. It basically proves to me that there are a lot of these like cross trait relationships that I frankly need to study a lot more if I want to get anything useful out of this kind of framework. But that is a good it's a very good observation because I found that quite interesting as well.
Right. So like some of these the traits are like, so this one had less morality, and it had negative morality and positive modesty, and morality and modesty are both in the agreeableness uh, category. Right. So it's not like you pick one from each category and then pick like an orientation on it.
Right. That's just a side effect of them being randomly generated. You get interesting interplays like this, which I think which by the way is realistic because I took as a sanity check on the whole project. The first thing I did when I started this was I took the test myself. And the results I got were very much scattered like that. Like within one category, I would have the lowest possible score on one and the highest on another. So that is actually realistic, unless I am just this like exceptional psychological anomaly that has this very distinct like brain chemistry. I doubt that's true. So in my experience, actually taking the exact same 300 question questionnaire that I gave the LLMs, I was getting kind of this random, grab bag assortment of trait scores. So while like the test is designed to measure 5 traits broken down into 6 subtraits, again, they're just kind of descriptive. And, being someone that is labeled high openness to experience does not necessitate that you're high emotionality or artistic interest or something like that. You could just be exceptionally high in the liberalism category, intellect category, etc. But like, so in some ways, this shows that it is actually acting like a human. These personalities are just kind of randomly generated, like you would expect human personalities to be, and they have kind of contradictions everywhere, as are typical in human psychology.
Sure. And what's interesting, so um, did you analyze like uh, whether or not the traits came out in the testing? Like,
What do you mean by that?
you gave it some traits, and then you tested for those traits. Was it accurate? Is the LLM accurately like answering?
You mean like are the traits exhibited in actual behavior beyond answers to
No,
a
no,
test?
no. Are the in the LLM in this analysis with the LLM, right? Like, did the LLM faithfully answer the questions according to its input?
I guess I didn't specifically look into the details of each of the calls, like where you would prompt the LLM and then like grab those answers and put them into this vector. But like I guess I just didn't feel
Like,
the need to do that.
I
And
mean, here,
here,
like, you told it to be liberal, right? And it ranked high in liberalism, along with everything else in that category. It just so happened. But like, in the orderliness, it ranked low in orderliness. So I would say that that's like a good sign that like you're having that the LLM is doing what you told it to.
right. And you can have that confidence again because of how it's scored. Like the score breakdown for orderliness is a composite of I guess it would be 10 questions that were asked pertaining to orderliness. And according to the score guide, as given in the reference that you can find in the community post, like as given by the psychological research, using that same scoring guide, it scored this score exactly. Oh, that's a screenshot, so I can't see the the
Huh.
breakdown. Um, well, it's up here. It will be up here somewhere. So I can see here's Jonathan. So like within orderliness, it did score 19. 19 is the real score that it got according to the official scoring guide, answering the official questions. So, I don't know the exact precise answers to every question that it gave, but as a composite, the 10 questions for orderliness did amount to a very low score. So you can extrapolate from that it was, correctly replicating the behavior we gave it for the minus orderliness prompt.
Right. So if that's like across the board, then that's like a powerful, it's really interesting.
Right. And I have looked pretty comprehensively at all 30 of these examples, and I don't think I found one where a trait that was specifically targeted was not correctly measured by the test. I mean, every single one, minus adventurousness. Adventurousness is pretty small, despite the fact that in this, this is Lidochka, despite the fact that every other openness to experience category is still high, the adventurousness category that was specifically targeted turned out low. And I think that's been the case with literally every single one of these traits across all of the examples. So it does seem that like these specific descriptions, like these verbal descriptions given by the research of like anger, like you can't, I guess, like you couldn't use the word anger, but the way that these psychologists in the literature described anger on this test, prompting with those descriptions was very effective for eliciting anger, low or high anger responses,
Just a quick
So
question about
Sure.
the scoring, if that's okay.
Sure.
So like in one of them here, you prompted, let's say, artistic interest. If the LLM crossed very likely, or like whatever the highest score was, like the 5-point score, I guess, on artistic interest questions in the 300 questions, then the maximum points it would show up is 50. Is that correct?
Yes. So
Okay.
each
So
question,
the
each
fact that
question, you're given a score 1 to
okay,
5 by 10 questions, max score 50.
okay. So because I think in the one the pair that you showed, you had, I think, modesty or morality. Modesty plus in the first for NLA. That doesn't seem to add up to 50, even though you did explicitly tell us to come out as
Yes,
triggered, I guess.
50, I will say, is like an exceptionally, exceptionally high score. I'll come to Annalie, however you would like to say that. So 50 is an exceptionally high score. Like when I took when I took the test myself, I got very few 50s and very few like I guess it would be 10s. Like usually you would expect it to be somewhere in the middle. What's kind of more important to look at, in my opinion, is that it's like relatively high. Um, I guess you could say like 36 is I guess like relative to, if you look at all the other ones, like there are a bunch that are super high, but 36 is not, I would not call 36 a particularly low score. Having worked with a lot of examples, having taken the test myself, I would not call 36 a particularly low score. And you also could probably attribute maybe a little bit of this to the fact that Annalie is also low morality, which is a trait within agreeableness. Um,
Mhm.
and so, you could look at any other one of these. Self-discipline is one that you could maybe even see correlating with some kind of modesty. But the point is like even like given relative to the other traits in this category and relative to a bunch of the other traits in this specific personality, like I would not consider 36, you're right, a particularly like exceptionally high score, but I also don't think that indicates that the test is failing to trigger a plus modest personality, especially given that there is sort of a trap trait kind of right under it that is specifically targeted. But again, it's difficult for me to assert that having not systematically studied, particularly which traits affect modesty. That's only my guess. But I will say like having a trait, or like having plus modesty, come out to 36 is not particularly concerning, even given that there are other traits that weren't targeted that are higher. Uh, it just means that it just means that there are probably some other factors at play here. What I meant kind of when I was explaining earlier about they're all kind of consistently working is that there aren't any examples, at least that I've seen. Maybe I've missed one, but I doubt it. I've kind of looked at these a good bit. There are no examples of like, you have minus achievement striving and then it comes out quite high. That doesn't happen. You have varying levels of interplay between traits, so you could get, minus achievement striving come out to something more like 25, which would, be higher than you would expect, but maybe some kind of interplay is causing that. You don't get anything that's minus achievement striving comes out to 45. So to that extent, the prompting is successful in conveying the traits. You never get something
I
that's
see.
opposite what you prompt.
Perfect. Thanks.
Sure.
And that's done by the LLM lexically,
Yeah.
which is really interesting. It's like it's taking all these words, putting them into like this big vector in the LLM embedding space, right? And it's a feature vector, however long it is. They're going to be like, it's going to rank high in certain features or certain connotations, and those, if you look at those dimensions and see like, okay, well, if this word has this connotation and this other word has the same connotation, does that common dimension like mean, what is that getting at? And so, like, it's factoring all this stuff through like that linguistic lexical embedding. And so, like, that's another like thing to think about is like, how does the LLM correlate all these different words and like saying like, okay, I was prompted with this language and I was asked about this language and I came out with this answer.
Right. No, it's very interesting to me as a linguist, particularly that like you kind of have this intricate web of words that are way more interconnected than we think they are. Because if you can get, basically statistical models, LLMs, to find these associations that we really don't even know in our head, then there's a lot there in terms of like linguistic, like sociolinguistic content about, inference and stuff like that. It is very, very interesting that like that this entire framework works entirely on language. That it is. I love that as a linguist that every single part of this works because the millions, trillions of training tokens are just this composite of human linguistic knowledge that put in and can basically capture these really complicated associations between like these different words and different behaviors and what they mean, kind of what they represent in the space of behaving like this word. Super, super interesting as a linguist that language is that powerful.
Right. So like all the statistical uh, relations between words, sort of embedded in that is sort of what you can extract out a theory of mind almost, possibly, for maybe.
That'd be very interesting if I did anything that I was able to get a theory of mind out of. But uh, I suppose you're not entirely wrong about that.
I mean, it's an open question, but is it possible? Yeah. Or I mean, I wouldn't suspect that the LLM has a theory of mind that it's working on to take the prompt and then like spit out these answers.
I would agree.
Brian, you have a
Um,
question?
Yeah, this is, if I understood what James was saying correctly earlier, the 5 dimensions that we have here are kind of arbitrary and they're just the result of some sort of dimension reduction. If you started from scratch and did the exact same exercise without people, but with LLMs, would you get the same dimensions?
that is quite interesting. Yeah. I'm sure there is definitely a way you could do that. Let me see if I can give you like an intuitive answer, just what I would
That's
think.
kind of what memes on chat is asking to does this imply that there are other potential ways to categorize these traits, group them?
The problem with that is that you ask the LLM the same question 100 times, it's probably not answered the same way unless you vary the pre-prompt. So that's the issue. So what is an interesting question is comparing different models for what their factors might be that that model has. So
Right.
There'll be
James,
some variation. There'll be some variation because it's slightly stochastic, but the idea with the factors is that there is variation between responses between people. But what you'll find if you just ask like one LLM, it's going to inherently cluster everything around one spot is my assumption. But it's an exercise worth doing, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
because the interesting thing is if you say clustering around one spot, what Luke has shown pretty compellingly is depending on the prompts, the clustering is very different.
Yes, that will happen. Yes.
Yes, so it's not only it's the model, it's the training set, it's the prompts.
Yeah.
And I put it in the chat but didn't respond. The other question that I'd asked was whether or not you checked how good or bad all of your persona do on the Wolfram benchmarking.
Yeah.
I have not tried that, but that's a very good that is a very good idea. I should go do that.
No, because it's really, really interesting because it's possible that if there's something that's semantically interesting in this, the kind of clustering that you get on a per model, per training set, per prompt basis is something else that we should be benchmarking.
Yes.
New LLM benchmark just dropped.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, memes made a comment about tweaking the temperature on the LLMs to see if that had an effect.
It's okay. So because I am approaching this kind of from this like, this grand vision, like I kind of tried to articulate at the beginning. Um, my idea for this is that like tweaking the temperature is a good idea, and I thought of this. I consider this, but I think the overall point of my project is that I'm trying to create like it is certainly interesting to answer questions about LMs, about psychology, about kind of the inner workings of these things. But I was coming at this from an angle of this is an engineering challenge, and if I want to create, some kind of system that is able to predict the behavior of something, well, I kind of want to make that more, democratic by keeping that process outside of, toying with like the model internally, toying with things like the temperature, toying with, the weights inside the model. I wanted to see if you could develop a pipeline purely based on, the linguistic output, that kind of just based on prompting input output from the LLM. I wanted to see if that was possible because, there certainly are a bunch of interesting scientific questions you could get at if you did do things like adjust temperature or, play with your own model, ran this test and, zapped at the weights a little bit. But the area I was specifically coming from with this, and I would love it if, people around the Wolfram ecosystem kind of took this work and went all these sort of different fun intellectual research directions with it. But my original intention with this was I was trying to create a pipeline for engineering agents that have specific behaviors you want them to, specific affinities that you want them to. And I was trying to create that pipeline such that anybody could really understand it just by prompting, just by asking your LLM questions and just by giving your LLM more information. As soon as you get into things like changing temperature, I think you sort of you add a degree of separation from your average user, your average, sales associate, or your average developer that's eventually going to be using models like this. So just from a practical standpoint, I wanted to focus my research on something that would be intelligible to, broadly intelligible to the people that will inevitably be using these systems that right now don't understand those kind of inner workings. that are going on inside. So it's a good idea, and I want to do it for sure. And I hope other people will get inspired by this and try things like that.
Yeah.
But personally, I'm just coming from this other standpoint that doesn't really uh, make sense with kind of changing things like that. But it's a good
I
idea.
would think that like decreasing temperature would force the LLM to pick like the highest ranked token, I guess the highest ranked like 1 out of 5 thing, and then you have like more consistent results, or might be truer to the personality that it's trying to get at.
You would think, yeah, you would, if you want to, speak in those terms, like you would think that would be the outcome. I didn't try it, so I can't say for sure. I don't want to lead you astray, but you would think that, decreasing the temperature, making the kind of more, I guess, decisive about what any given answer would be, then you could get more standardized answers. But I think I was, again, specifically interested in just evaluating the models as they are, just, straight through the OpenAI API, the way that plenty of probably non-technical developers would be doing it and see what those results were. So you would think that turning the temperature down would make things more consistent, but my interest was in just attacking the systems as they come out of the box. So that was my approach. If there are no more questions kind of about those graphs, and feel free to ask whenever. This is kind of the last thing I have, which is just sort of a dive into maybe the more intellectual kind of research sort of tasks, which is about these clustering. So this is a community graph plot. And I explained earlier, like way back at the very beginning when I showed this plot on the first page, full circle. Now we're at the end. Congratulations. This is all paid off. You're here. This plot is community clustered, and out of every point, there are 3 arrows that go to different points, and those 3 arrows are the closest neighbors. I have a Euclidean distance version and a cosine distance version, which are the exact same with the exception of a single point, uh, which is this one. Sylvia, I have it. Yeah, I have it so that these graphs, by the way, are on the community post. So if you want to play with these and look at whatever you want, they're up there. If you hover your mouse over any of the points, the name, traits, and results graph come up. So yeah, this is Sylvia. And this is the only point that changed cluster between the Euclidean distance version of this closeness nearest neighbor graph and the cosine distance version. And so this is Sylvia's Big Five test. And maybe this is a nothing burger. And I think in my head, this looks like it's pretty just kind of dead average across the board, kind of on everything. Like it's kind of somewhere in the middle on openness, somewhere in the middle, maybe a little low on conscientiousness, somewhere in the middle for extroversion, pretty it's high in agreeableness, but that's kind of the exception, and then somewhere in the middle on neuroticism. So that might have something to do with it. Again, I don't know. You might be able to look at it more. But otherwise, all of these graphs are the same, at least in terms of clustering. The nearest neighbor, obviously, a little bit different just because the clusters are in different spaces, but only one of them actually changes position within clusters. So inside these clusters, you can kind of see like they're definitely vague, and it's not an exact science, but looking within the clusters, you can kind of see that the shapes of the graphs are relatively similar. Like this seems to be the graph for people with low neuroticism, and everything else is particularly maybe high. It's not always the case. You have this one where they are relatively high, but up in the 200 range isn't exceptionally high like you'd see out of this one, and these are a little bit different, but more or less the shape is kind of the same. This is if you go to this category, you kind of get like a similar shape. You have this like staircase shape, which isn't perfect in all of them. It's kind of raggedy, but you kind of have this same idea of like, you know, incredibly low neuroticism scores, except with the exception of this one. But you kind of see general shape trends, again, not an exact science, but I think this, I'll go over all the categories, I guess, while I talk. I
Low
think
on
this just
extroversion,
short,
it seems, this one.
yeah, this, you know, you can come up with all sorts of narratives in your head about what these actually describe, because every time you think you have one, you find an example that maybe doesn't fit it like you thought it would.
That's the
Um,
group that's like at the party, like in the corner, like just shoegazing at each other.
Yeah, something like that. And so I think what I pointed out in the paper was interesting about these is that like naively, like the naive approach would be you might expect because there are five clusters, and so naively you might think that like okay, each of the five clusters represents people who are particularly high in one trait. And you don't see that, which I think is good because I don't think you would see that in humans either, because humans are kind of this like aggregate of all of our traits. And so I think like a psychologist with more experience might be able to classify people with these certain psychological profiles with certain like names in research that they have given to people that exhibit these kind of traits. Like so this one you see kind of like moderate agreeableness, but everything else is kind of high around it. Um, so there are probably, you know, psychologists out there who study this, you know, for a living, who could give more comprehensive breakdowns of these like psychological profiles. But I think it's interesting to note that they're not clustered based on uh, particular high or low scoring in one specific category. It doesn't seem like. Rather, they're kind of general archetypes where like the shape formed by the five independent bars is kind of relatively similar. Um, which I think is a good kind of analog for human personality behavior because again, I took the test and you don't kind of see this like high in one thing, low in everything else, or vice versa, low in one thing, high in everything else. Um, so I think that given that they're clustering based on these kind of just general shape personality archetypes, you could say, I think is kind of a good sign that this is relatively accurate for describing human behavior. I think I'll insert here just one last kind of bit of interesting things that there's a sort of it definitely doesn't work this way. I'm not claiming that it does, but there is a very interesting startup project that has been brought to my attention recently called Artificial Societies, where they use data to engineer LLMs to replicate human behavior, and they do this on a large scale, such that you can, for example, test the performance of a social media post before you post it. You can go on and you can create this environment where you have, for example, 25,000 LLMs that represent, 25,000 trained personas based on your followers. And then it'll, tell you how many people would be expected to share it, be expected to like it, stuff like that. And I only bring this up because it's kind of an interesting potential use case for something like this, where you can think of it in the agent capacity, like I've been thinking of it. Whereas if you have an agent that's particularly good at sales, you could reverse engineer its personality and then inject it into a different AI, and you would hope that that AI becomes good at sales given these specific parameters. Well, I guess the same is true if you can maybe replicate someone else's behavior from online. If you go through a Twitter account and you feed all of that training data into someone's into an LLM, feed all of the data from someone's Twitter into an LLM, and then analyze that LLM's behavior. Well, you could take that LLM, give it this test, and you could perhaps recreate that sort of behavior without having to feed it all of the data that it's posted on Twitter since 2018. So it's little projects like this, little applications like this, where just kind of a shortcut way to engineer LLM behavior and personality could actually be really, really interesting and useful for all sorts of different business applications, research applications. Um, so that I think is kind of as a whole where I'm at right now. I think I think the research that I've done has done a decent job or made a decent case that via prompting, you can target aspects of personality. Again, you might be able to develop a test that's more suited for LLM specifically, rather than the one this one that's tuned for humans. But I think it's a really good step in the right direction that I've shown that you can prompt LLMs with personality, and you can measure these personalities with tests that already exist. You don't really have to reinvent the wheel to start approaching, agent personality design this way. And I think that could be really, really big and important, and give, again, kind of democratize the process of engineering decision-making agents in a way that anybody who, speaks natural language can understand and use. So
Yeah,
that is where I'm
sort
at.
of
There's plenty of more visions and goals for the future. Again, please go check out the community post. I'm sure there'll be a link to it somewhere on wherever platform you're watching this. Or, reach out to me, luke.weinbach@yale.edu. Happy to chat about anything. And I really like when people think my work is cool and come to talk to me about it. So I'm taking any other questions if there are any, but other than that, that's kind of all I've got for today.
Yeah. Brady from the live chat is asking if you know your own personality, big five traits, your score, your test results or whatever, could you then engineer an LLM to sort of be a compatible LLM companion?
Well, first of all, I'd be remiss if I did not.
I mean, not companion, but just the compatible personality.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't add at the beginning of this statement a disclaimer that this is probably the worst use for LLMs I've ever seen in my entire life, trying to create an AI girlfriend or something
No,
like
no,
that.
that's he didn't.
But in terms of just engineering a personality that you would get along with,
Just a
or
compatible
engineering
personality.
ChatGPT, yeah, engineering ChatGPT to be sound like one of your friends or something like that. First of all, I should also say I think there's a good amount of research coming out now that suggests you shouldn't do that even if you could. But if you could, I suppose this could be a step. I would love for someone to try that. In fact, I probably might try it. What I would want to try is to take the test myself, and sort of engineer that personality into an LLM and see if, given certain decisions, if me and that LLM kind of do the same thing. That would be a nice step in the direction of figuring out whether or not these things have human analog. I would love it if they did, and that would be really, really interesting if I could kind of recreate myself online, kind of just, with my basic behavioral profile. Could be really, really cool. But in theory, that is kind of the applications that I'm developing this for, is so you can find out something interesting about some system, whether the system is some LLM or yourself, reverse engineer that into a personality profile, and then you have a template kind of for prompting that personality template into another system, so that hopefully you can replicate the good things about the behavior that the original system was doing. So that is kind of exactly the sort of application I would think would come out of this. If if you have a best friend and you give them this test, well, if you give that personality profile to an LLM, maybe you can have an LLM best friend that kind of acts in the same way and laughs at the same jokes, whatever. But I think that is kind of
whenever you use an LLM, it wouldn't contradict you or drive you crazy. Basically, it's would you have an agreeable experience? I guess. On the flip side, it's can you engineer an LLM that would just at every turn just really piss you off or something like that?
Right. Targeted personality malware basically is just you create a bot that sends your worst enemy emails, and you engineer it to have the most annoying possible personality of that person.
If I was doing deep research, let's say, and I'm okay, well, what do you think about this idea, LLM? It's oh, that's the best idea ever, really great. I'm no, that's not what I need. Feedback that I could trust. Don't just be a yes man.
Yeah, and there's good evidence to support. There's good research coming out now that suggests that that's very damaging to your mentality if you just have your LLM yes man all the time telling you what to do. So don't use it for that. But in theory, you could, and that is kind of what my research is trying to do. can you replicate behavior kind of just by feeding this like kind of generic personality profile into as training data into an LLM? So,
Brian, you have a question?
Yeah. So the thing that I find really, really interesting about this presentation is, so there's a gazillion gigabytes of data making a generic LLM, and then a dozen sentences turning it into an extrovert or an introvert, right?
right.
Why doesn't that work with people?
Well, that's a funny question. I guess like, well, okay. Because I guess you can't and you can't engineer people like you can computers. The LLM is designed to adapt and take in data that you give it through a prompt. And then, that data goes inside its brain somewhere, and that has like a, permanent effect, albeit even if it's a small one, a permanent effect on kind of the weights and, relational vectors between words and stuff like that. So you give an LLM this list of sentences, and it tries to replicate that behavior based on kind of all of its aggregated data. For humans, humans are very resistant to change in a way that computers are not. I suppose you couldn't tell me to start being an introvert, and I don't know what that means because I've only ever been an extrovert, for example. LLMs in theory, like the whole principle of LLMs that you train it on this kind of generalized set so it kind of knows everything there is to know, and then you can fine tune it into something that you want it to be. Humans are kind of just the aggregate of all their experiences, and we can't really replicate things we don't know or understand. um, so I think that's kind of the interesting opportunity you have with LLMs, is that in theory, the premise of an LLM is that it kind of knows everything before you start, and then it's, choose your own adventure from there. You can do kind of anything with it. You can engineer it to be whatever you really want it to be, and it will have some sort of pre-embedded knowledge of that thing you want it to be. Um, I wish it worked
Yeah,
with
that's
you. It would be quite nice, but
yeah, it's an interesting thing to explore, because you could even pre-prompt it with a specific personality direction and then change it over time and see if there's any latent personality after you've changed the prompt from it being neurotic to agreeable and vice versa. I would actually argue that humans work exactly the same. If I had told you to answer the personality test questions as if you were highly neurotic and a person that was like had this profile, then it would affect the answers that you give the test. And if you do the test yourself, there's a lot of emphasis in how you do the test. So for example, you need to not be distracted. You need to answer it within a 30-minute time frame. You need to be uncaffeinated. You need to there's a lot of aspects to try to get your true personality, because it's very malleable to any kind of human prompts that you receive just before the time. And even in the phrasing, like how they answer the how they ask the questions, they say like, in your day-to-day life, would the people you spend the most time around you think you are this way or that way? So you're not even answering it in terms of how you think you are, it's how people around you think you are. So it's very context dependent, and very subjective. So if even in taking the test they had said, given some scenario where you're on an adventure and you come across some people, how would they think? Just that pre-prompt of saying you're on an adventure would probably increase your adventurousness. So I would say we are quite malleable to that. And that's what you see
which,
in
by the way, is
products.
why one of the focal points I mentioned at the beginning is that one of the main things I want to do, like from here, from this point onward, is to see whether or not, like, okay, so I know that you input a personality and it answers this set of 300 questions as if it were that personality. That, I think the next step is showing, okay, you have this personality. Now, do you actually act like someone that has that personality given certain scenarios? Because if you eventually want to use this for something like sales or something like, strategic decision making. If I have a leader in my company and I give him this test and I just take those results, put it into that 300 dimensional vector, and throw it back in as a prompt to an LLM, then given a set of historical decisions that that leader made, does the LLM with that personality make the same decisions? You know, intuition might suggest that might be a little bit oversimplified. You might not get a perfect, one-to-one match record, but even if it's more than chance, more than 50-50, can you get it to recreate behavior based on a personality profile? That's still interesting to know. And it still suggests that we might be moving in the right direction on this, that you can just input this sort of bare bones personality template into an LLM, and it would match, kind of semi-match at least, the behavior of someone who has the same personality that is a human, not an LLM. So that's the next step. And I was trying to kind of evangelize that at the beginning, that that is the important thing that we're kind of moving toward. We know that it can answer the test, but can it actually act like what I tell it to act like? And that is an open question that I will be working on in the near future. So if you make any
Yeah,
headway,
it's also
yeah,
that's also kind of like interesting from a psychological perspective, and on the science of that is how behavior matches personality, because
right.
there are correlations there, but that's also this is it's a highly studied field in personality research to actually find like what those true correlations are and try to understand this
Yes.
stuff. It is quite interesting.
It'd be fun to sort of see how this could relate to storytelling or story writing. Um, like you have all these characters moving around and like they go into different situations. You want them to have like a consistent like personality type or have a personality arc throughout the story, and sort of choose their own adventure, sort of computational storytelling, or NPCs in a game, for instance.
Yeah. I think there's a bunch of different applications for this, which is why it's kind of so exciting, but it's also why it's kind of intimidating to present it to, the web in this state, having just barely shown that I can even, get correct responses on this test after prompting it. Because there's so many directions, there's so many great ideas that people have been giving about where I can take this. But that's kind of why I hope that enough people watch this that they're actually interested, and they start, they can go to the post and download the notebook and start playing with some of these things on their own, do their own experimentation. Because I think it's super interesting, answers a lot of questions, like ranging all the way from like industry and practical engineering applications to, the really just like fundamental psychological linguistic uh, questions, even about like how LLMs function. So it's super, super, super interesting, and I hope enough people get interested.
Yeah, super interesting. Really cool stuff, and so much to do with it. Moving forward, there's like a lot of things that can come out of this type of research.
For sure, yeah. So, I mean, I'm done. If we have any more questions from live chat or from anyone in the Zoom call.
Um, no, I think we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Luke.
appreciate everybody for being here. Appreciate all the attention. I have a timer going next to me. This went significantly longer than I thought it was going to. So thank you if you stayed to the end, and thank you if you were paying attention. Hope I can answer everything to your satisfaction. If I didn't, I said my email at some point earlier in this little stream. So luke.weinbach@yale.edu. Ask me questions, and would love to chat. So.
All right. Thank you, Brian and Damaris, for signing on and joining the discussion. Thank you again, Luke. Thank you to everyone.